This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. We're going to be talking about Bad Blood, the television series. So thank you for joining us. I am very excited today to be joined yet again by Mustache Chris to talk about the television series Bad Blood, which was a very faithful, and at least in my opinion, representation of the Vito Rizzuto story. Chris, how is it going?
I'm doing quite well myself. Been quite excited to, go into the TV, get into this TV series, and then we can start breaking down more of the truth to it, because we did like kind of a quick overview in the last episode, and this one we can actually start breaking down the major characters, and we picked one that we're going to really break down so far and a couple others. But as we go through the series, we're going to talk about like the bikers and all that. And so, yeah, I'm pretty excited.
The series Bad Blood models basically the end career of mafia impresario. I mean, any title you can add to him, Vito Rizzuto. And like Mustache said, we talked about him in the last episode, so you would definitely be worth your time to go check out that episode just to get a little bit of background. We'll get into more background and discussion of this series in general. Now, Vito Rizzuto was the Don, you might say, or the boss of Montreal. And just to maybe set the table a little bit, Chris, what was going on with the mafia in Montreal in this 1990s to the 2000s to basically the 1970s to the early 2000s in your 2 minutes, basically?
The Rizzuto family pretty much ran organized crime in Montreal, and then like later on Vito ended up expanding into Ontario too, but by extension, by controlling Montreal, they kind of ran organized crime. The further you got away from Montreal, the less control they have, but you could argue that they pretty much ran organized crime in all of Canada, really. This is like the mega center of the organized crime in Canada. So Vito was the head honcho, but the Hells Angels were there, and the Haitian street gangs were starting up at this point, and the West End gang, which was an Irish gang that ran the port. But Vito was I guess, as they say in the TV show, he was like the CEO of organized crime, and he was basically running the entire, the entire scam, I guess you want to, that's what they call it, like running scams.
And then these mobsters in Italian mafia guys, Rizzuto and his company in Montreal, they were very closely connected with what was going on in New York. Can you lay that out in a sentence or two?
Oh, yeah. So the Rizzuto, the Montreal Mafia initially started off, it was basically just an offshoot of the Bonanno family, which is one of the 5 families in New York. By the time that this show's taking place, there's still some kind of connection to the Bonanno family, but it's a lot. It's not as important as it was when initially the mafia was starting up in Montreal. Rizzuto was one of the most successful mobsters of all time, so he basically ran Montreal by himself. I'm sure there's probably some organized crime buffs that will push back on that, because apparently Rizzuto was still sending tribute to New York, but from everything that I've read, he wasn't sending much, and it was more like, whatever, just take this, just leave me alone type of thing.
Well, really kind of the book, the Bible of this story is called The Sixth Family. And in a way that they were the sixth family of the mafia, tying it back to the big 5 families of New York, classical 5 families.
when they outlasted them all too, right? Like when Gotti went down, all the other families quickly followed suit, and then the Bonanos. Well, we'll get into it in the TV show as we go through the TV show, but they ended up a lot of them turning on each other. Joe Messina, who was the head of the Bonanno family, was the first mafia boss to turn state witness, and I mean, by the end of it all, the Rizzuto family was really the last major family standing.
This show, the Bad Blood, but really, I think this is a good time to maybe talk about the overview. I watched it more or less when it came out originally, way back in 2017. And I think I watched it maybe not too long after it came out. And I just loved it. I mean, loved it because I think it was such a throwback to the old school mafia movies, those Martin Scorsese movies of the 80s. I think it really captured something of that. But you know how we're always talking about, oh, I wish they had made a series out of that. They actually did.
Yeah. And I didn't actually watch this show initially when it came out. I only started watching it when we were discussing about doing the Rizzuto family and then doing the show Bad Blood along with it. So I only started watching it just recently, and like I've seen the whole first season. I've watched most of the second season. I believe we're just going to do the first season because the second season's kind of its own thing. And I love it. I think it's a great TV show, especially if you know about the history of the Rizzuto crime organization. It does a really good job of telling the story pretty truthfully. I mean, they change some things here and there, but you know, if you really, if you enjoy the history behind the history of the organized crime in Montreal, you'll love this show.
Plus the show, it was, I mean, we could kind of say it's low budget in a way. It's a Canadian production from, one of the local Canadian channels, but it has a really impressive cast. It's the scenery is legit. A lot of it's shot in Montreal, which I guess a lot of shows are shot in Canada these days. But I think you get a real feeling of things. If you go back to like our Narc episode, and a lot of movies these days that are supposed to be set in Chicago and New York City, and you can just feel they're not in Chicago or New York City. They're probably in Toronto or in Montreal. I think that you got a legitimacy in this show because it had the French Canadian element. It had the Anglo Canadian element, plus this Italian thing going on. I think it really captured those elements.
Oh, the TV channel that it was City TV, which is a Toronto-based TV channel.
Yeah, it's really not the prime channel. It's kind of a second tier, I would think.
Yeah, it really was. Like a little history, like City TV was, I don't know, they were famous. Like, I'm trying to think, the guy who owned City TV was kind of like the Howard Stern of like television or something, kind of like back in the day. Like City TV used to just, I don't know, just play crazy. It's more legitimate now, but they used to play like really crazy stuff. And they'd have like a new show called Breakfast Television. And it was always just like, it was live, but there was always tons of mistakes. And I know I just have good memories of City TV.
Yeah, as a Canadian, I think that's got to be a connection with you, is that this is something that's really up your alley. Now, let's start with, so we've set the table a little bit. The main character is Declan, who's a fictionalized character. He's played by Kim Coates, who is also the producer. And Kim Coates, he's one of those actors. He made probably his biggest name was in Sons of Anarchy, but he's been in a million other movies. Like once you've seen his face and put the name to it, you're like, oh yeah, he was in this, he was in that. Tell us a little bit about him, because when I first saw this series, I didn't know much about the Rizzuto story. And then I started to read a little bit about it, and I was like, holy smokes, this has a lot of this is very accurate in a lot of ways. But I thought that the whole Declan character was kind of a plot device to go forward, but in a lot of ways, he has a connection to an actual historical character. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Renaud Desjardins.
Oh yeah, so that's Declan is like you pointed out, he's a fake character, but he was really inspired by a famous Canadian criminal. I guess you can't really call him a mobster because he wasn't actually in the mob, and they touched on that in the TV show because he was French Canadian. Renard Desjardins. I think I'm pronouncing that. My French is terrible, but I think I'm pronouncing that properly.
Sounds all right. You have to say it more than
with a little bit more attitude. I mean, if you read people who study organized crime in Canada, Renard Desjardins was considered probably one of the most influential non-Italians in the mafia. I guess if we can think of a comparison of the previous episode, I guess he was kind of like Jimmy Burke from the Goodfellas episodes that we did, where he was Irish but he was still like highly influential within the mafia. I guess Renard Desjardins would be, if you're thinking of something equivalent, but in Canada, not in New York in the United States. And Renard started his career. I mean, I guess it would be pretty typical of, a hood. He started working as a waiter in a mob-owned nightclub, and I started making connections there and was selling hashish and heroin to the people that would show up to the club, obviously with the mob supporting them, because it's usually why they own nightclubs, is to traffic drugs out of them. And, that's what they do.
Would, yeah.
And I guess he ended up getting into contact with the Catroni family. And if you remember from our previous episode, the Catroni family were the guys that were running Montreal, the Calabrians that were running Montreal before the Rizzutos. And he rose up pretty quickly within that family. He and his one of the mob guys ended up marrying his sister, which gave him kind of a unique position because he was like an Italian that an Italian married his sister, so he was like a non-Italian that was kind of, he was family through marriage. And even to the point where he was a chaperone for Paolo Violi, and we talked about him on the previous episode, to Rastelli's christening as the head of the Bonanno family. This is, for a non-Italian, it's really crazy if you research a little bit about the mob, or you even have listened to some of our previous episodes about the mob. They're not very high on Italians. And I mean, even sometimes they're not even very high on like fellow Italians. Oh, you're from Calabria, or you're not Sicilian. So for him to be able to do stuff like this, they must have thought very highly of him.
How does he move on then? He's made this big connection in a world where you set that up, where even mafia, what we would call mafia, like the Ndrangheta, or boy, I murdered that. The Calabrian, the Ndrangheta, the most difficult mafia pronunciation group in the world. They're not a mafia enough for these Sicilians, who we're going to talk about that. The quote unquote, they called them zips, mafia guys straight from Sicily, and these are hard dudes. Yet they accept this Renaud Desjardins as almost one of their own, just short of being made.
Yeah, and so we got in the last episode, we got into a little bit about the civil war that breaks out between the Catroni family and the Rizzuto family, and the Rizzutos obviously wind up on top. And the Rizzuto family was smart in the sense that they were willing to take on some of these people that were working with the Catroni family, as long as they were showing loyalty to them. And Bernard was one of these guys, right? So he gets in pretty deep with the Rizzuto family. And he's probably most famous for he had a Lebanese drug connection. I don't. This is like a pretty crazy story. So in Lebanon, there's the Christian Phalange movement, which is like a right wing movement in Lebanon. It's from everything that I read about it, they're just hyper Christian and about supporting Christian rights in Lebanon, right? And they were a rebel faction. If anybody knows a little bit more about it, you can just message us because I didn't spend a ton of time reading about it. But basically, they would produce hashish and they would trade the hashish for guns, which the Rizzuto family and Renard was the go between these guys. They buy the hat. Well, they basically trade the hat to get the hash for guns. And this system worked for a really long time.
Is that connected at all into the French connection?
It's the French connection was more heroin than hashish, but it shows like kind of the international connection that the Rizzuto family had, because they had this Lebanese connection, and then they also had the French connection, and then there was also the pizza connection, which was like later on, which is exactly how it sounds. It's literally they set up pizza parlors all around, like in New York and up here in Canada, that legitimately they did sell pizza. They were just selling coke and heroin out of the back too.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. It's so interesting too, these, and maybe it's something that we'll even tie into at later points, is these political movements like the IRA and the Phalange in Lebanon. They're political movements, but they're tying themselves in with the mafia just for this money train, just massive amounts of money that they could use to fuel their political violence.
Oh yeah, when we eventually get into Whitey Bulger, like Whitey Bulger was connected to the IRA too, right? Just to kind of put in perspective just how big this hashish trade was, like almost it's estimated at the time that this connection was going on, like 90% of the hash that was coming into Canada was coming from Lebanon, and Renard Desjardins was the one overseeing pretty much all of this. Like, it's just wild. 90%.
It's also amazing this when you delve into the story, and the movie really taps into it, or the television series rather, is that they were tied in with this European drug trade of the hashish and the heroin coming in through Europe. And when that kind of dried up, and they were already setting up for the burgeoning South American drug trade that was going to come up, they got plugged into all of that in a way that I think that the regular mafia, maybe the New York mafia, didn't capitalize on like they did.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, in the Rizzuto family, they didn't really have any hangups about dealing drugs. Where American mafia, like, we can debate about it, but like they all took the money and they kind of all did it, but there was hangups about it. The Rizzuto family and the real Costa Nostra, the real Sicilians, they didn't care. Whatever, let's just deal it.
Yeah, we talked about this a lot offline, is that there was really this conflict between the American mafia, Italian-American mafia, that in a lot of cases, these mafiosi in America had lived, they were second, third generation, and they're in conflict against the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, who they're more, in a way that I would compare them to the cartels in Mexico. They have almost no compunction about what they do. They'll gun down a guy in front of his wife. They'll kidnap kids. Like, they don't have any problems with doing any of that stuff. Where, I mean, as much as the mafia was really dirty in the US, they had certain lines that they didn't generally cross. Even somebody as insane as, say, Roy DeMeo, there was some lines that he just naturally didn't cross.
Well, and like when he accidentally killed that kid, he apparently locked himself in his room for like a week and didn't leave. Like that was the biggest. Like we'll probably end up getting into the Sicilian Mafia, like in Sicily, but when you really start getting into it, that's like the biggest thing that'll stand out to you if you study the American Mafia is the Sicilian Mafia just does not care. Like, and it's relies almost 100% on like pure terror comes across, where like the American Mafia, I never really got that sense. And like you pointed out, like the American Mafia typically wouldn't go after kids, wouldn't go after wives, wouldn't go after like extended family. They tried to keep it as much in-house as they possibly could. Obviously, some of this it's spilt on the streets and it wasn't, but there was a general understanding that we'd try to keep it in-house as much as we possibly can, unless something kind of totally unless something gets really crazy. Or the Sicilian Mafia, it almost seems like it's, that was like the go-to. It's like, oh, like you're doing this, like we're going right after, like that's the first thing they seem to do. It's just like, we're going right after your wife and kids.
The political violence too. In Sicily, they were blowing up judges all the time. I think there was one that wasn't too long ago where they rubbed out a judge in Sicily, and stuff like that is pretty rare here. Like if you even think back to our Iceman episode, it was a big deal when was it Sammy the Bull supposedly had the Iceman Richard Kuklinski kill a cop, and Kuklinski wouldn't have probably have done it if he knew, even though it was a dirty cop. Like that was a line that they generally didn't cross in the US. Or if you go down to old Mexico or go to old Sicily, they're doing that stuff all the time. Political violence.
It's like a rite of passage in Sicily, almost. It's like, like in the American mob, they have like a saying, like, you're making your bones, which basically means like, oh, like you kill somebody, then like you're in, right? Like you take care of a problem for us, and it's usually just another mob guy or low end criminal that's going to talk or what have you. Or in like Sicily, it seems like making your bones is like, oh, you got to at least kind of shoot a police officer or something crazy like that.
So tell us a little bit more about this Renaud Desjardins, and then we can talk, get into how he was portrayed as Declan in the Bad Blood series.
Okay, yeah. So Renaud ended up becoming the between the Rizzuto family, the Hells Angels, and the various other gangs, but in particular the Hells Angels, that's a pretty big deal, because the Hells Angels were the second biggest gang, I would argue, in Montreal at the time. And so the Hells Angels would have issues about anything, or maybe even with the Rizzutos, and Renaud would, go back and forth, relaying this information between the two groups. That's pretty important. It's kind of it reminds me a little bit about when Roy DeMeo opened up the connection between the Gambino family and the Westies in some ways, where he ended up becoming like the go-between guy between those two groups. It just reminded me a little bit about that. Yeah, so that just further shows that how important he was in the family, and how much trust the Rizzuto family, and in particular Vito, had for him to play that role, because it very easily could just have manipulated it to his own advantage. And from my understanding, he never really did. Him, and then later on, him and a bunch of Hells Angels got caught up in it's called Operation Jaggy. Don't ask me why they called it that, but they did, which was an RCMP operation, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I'm trying to think of like, I guess they're like the FBI in Canada would be the equivalent. Like they're the national police, right? Caught Renaud and the Hells Angels trafficking was like 700 kilos of cocaine from Venezuela. And if you had listened to our previous episode, that's where Nico set up the drug connections with the Caruana clan and the cartels down in South America. So he gets caught, and then the cops go to him and say, like, hey, you can get out of this. You just got to, give us information on Vito, and you probably won't even serve any time, because that's who they really wanted, was Vito Rizzuto. And Renard says, I'm not talking. He goes, I'll serve my time, and I'm going to shake Vito's hand when it's all said and done. That's how, I mean, you can take that as like self-serving, because if he became a rat, then he could never get back into criminality. But, he ended up doing some kind of deal where he got charged with transporting less kilos. And I don't understand how that works in the court, but whatever. He still ended up getting 15 years in jail. But while he was in jail, he got the nickname the Millionaire, and obviously had a lot of money, right, from illegal activities, and had like a contractor come in and like modify his police cell. And it was like a huge scandal up here in Canada when that came out. And then he ended up running a gang in the prison of mafioso and Hell's Angels, and basically ran the prison for 15 years and didn't say a word, didn't rat Vito out. And I mean, for Renard's story, and I think we should just kind of leave it there, because as we can get more into it as the show goes on.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that, because there's something that will continue to come up, is that criminal justice system in Canada isn't quite as harsh might be the word to use, that somebody like Renard could get a 15-year prison sentence, and almost right off the bat, he's only going to serve 7 of it, if that, in very cushy conditions, where something that's important to the series just in the very first episode is going to happen to Vito that will be very different. But let's hold off on that for just a second and talk about, I think that Kim Coates was absolutely masterful. I loved the swagger he brought to that Declan character.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I really love you could tell that he's blue collar. He's from the streets. And there's even a scene in I think it's the first episode, where Vito's trying to buy him a suit, and he's like, oh, I'm just not a suit guy. And everything that I've read about like Renard, that's the impression that I get, is very much a street guy. He's like the polar opposite of somebody, say, like Paul Castellano.
Then the other thing that I think the show really did well is this situation that you set up of the Haitians and the Irish and the biker gangs and all this. And the show paints it as such a clean operation that's so smooth, but that's really how it was, at least for a long time, that Vito was the CEO and he controlled the whole thing, but he had this cog of the Haitian street gangs who had their particular speciality. And then you had the bikers who had their speciality in the whole thing. And then the Irish gang that had their specialized part of this whole operation. And Vito had the vision. Declan / Renal had the ability to organize it all. And then all these individual pieces, they show it as a very clean thing in the show. And that's what it was.
Yeah, there's like a scene where it sets it up, and they do a pretty good job of just showing the audience how it all works. Like and Vito's coming out of a meeting or something like that, and you have like the biker leader and the West End gang leader, and then the Haitian leader, and he basically tells them, it's like, we can't be fighting each other because it just doesn't make sense. It's not good for business. It brings heat. It does. If we all work together, there's more than enough money for everything, for everyone to go around, right? And for a mob boss to be working with somebody like with people from the Hells Angels, right? Who the leader in the Hells Angels is supposed to be Mom Boucher, and we're definitely going to be getting into him later because he was quite a character. Working with people like really closely, like with the Hells Angels and Irish gangs and even like Haitian street gangs. was very unique. Like the five families would work with other criminals, right? But not the way kind of Vito had set it up. And he had a vision, right? Where, like, I guess I could, saying to himself, like, I guess I could fight with the Hells Angels, and I guess I could fight with all these other gangs, but like, what profit is that really going to give me? It's just going to affect business, and it's probably better if I just work with these guys.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. What did you think about initially what they set up, this kind of this internal conflict with Vito, that he wants to become legit?
Yeah.
Did you get that? I kind of didn't get that sense from about the real Vito, that he wanted to somehow become legit.
Reading about him, I think he did too. I think more so as kids, he wanted to be able to leave what he had created to a degree, and I don't think he wanted his son involved in it and like the rest of his family. But I don't think Vito ever wanted to stop being mafia. That's who he was. He was born into it.
I think one of the things that I've really learned from this series of, really throwing ourselves into the underworld is some people just like being criminals. They don't want to play by the rules, and they like it. Look at one of them actually said it. I think it was the one of the bosses in Goodfellas, and the actual they were Bonanos as well, I believe.
Lucchese.
The one guy, he loves stealing. It was a thrill for him, and you get this, and I feel like you get this in the series, that amongst these criminal gangs of the Irish and the bikers and the Haitians, some of them just liked being criminals. They didn't want to. And I mean, look at Roy DeMeo. He could have been a legitimate business person and probably made more money than he did, but they like, in some cases, killing folks. In other cases, stealing and just running these scams. They loved it.
You don't do it unless you like it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, like, why else would you do? Like, once you're in the mob, then like you can't get out, right? But it's not like it's easy to join the mob. It's not like you show up to a club and go like, "Oh, can I join the Lucchese family guys?" Like, you have to make your bones. So you know what you're doing, and you obviously enjoying what you're doing if you're going to go that far to join a criminal organization.
Yeah, just think about yourself. Like, I'm sure there's days where you don't feel like waking up in the morning and punching the clock. I know I don't, but I also don't want to go sell drugs or go tie somebody up and like put them in a machine to crush them or something, like, I think that there's a real difference between somebody that's not just an incidental thing. That's a part of their character, is that they're criminals. I think there's very few people, we've maybe stumbled across one or two people who just kind of stumbled into the life of crime. But I think most of the people who we've looked at were like a heat-seeking missile to the life of crime.
Oh, for sure. And then like you add on top of it, like something like the mafia, and it's like you're part of this society that's like a society within a society, and they're like the ultimate rebels. They don't pay taxes. They don't follow the rules. Everyone pays them respect. The cops pay them respect. I can see the appeal of it.
Now let's move on to, the star of the show, really. It's Vito Rizzuto, played by I would dare say great actor, Anthony LaPaglia. He's Australian, yet he's been in tons of movies in America. And I think I had even read someplace that he's worked so hard on having kind of a generic accent that he speaks with that. He doesn't really speak with an Australian accent anymore. He doesn't really have a American. He doesn't have a Canadian accent. He's like tried to do something that's straight down the middle. How do you think, just to set us up, how do you think he played Vito Rizzuto?
I thought he did a really good job, honestly. Just like I think obviously he watched a lot of video of him in terms of how Vito moves and kind of the clothes and stuff that Vito would wear. I mean, Anthony's he's kind of overweight here. Vito was never, I mean, he wasn't a thin man, right? But he wasn't really overweight. And Anthony's a little bit shorter. Vito was, for an Italian, for like a Sicilian, he was quite tall. He was like 6'3" or 6'2". That was his nickname, was the tall guy, the tall man.
I think he really grabbed something with the character. I feel watching him, like if I wanted to envision, I would think that's probably as close as you're going to get. And also Vito's dad, Nico, who's played by Paul Sorvino in one of his last role. I mean, I almost wept. I enjoyed it so much watching Paul Sorvino just be Paul Sorvino.
And he nails Niccolo, I think, personally, perfectly. And even like Anthony, what people always said about Vito is like Vito was always slow to talk, and he was really reflective and thought a lot about what he would before he would say something. But there's a simmering intensity just boiling right underneath the surface, and Anthony, I think, captures that perfectly.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I also I would just add with Paul Sorvino with Nico, he runs almost up to the borderline of cliche, of mafia cliche and like Paul Sorvino cliche, but he never quite hits it. And I think that's maybe why he did such an awesome job. Like he would just be talking English and then speak Italian. And I think that's probably what Nico was like, especially an old man. I think he was the perfect age. He was the perfect, I'm sure people might argue out there about it. But for me, at least, I mean, I got yelled at online about saying how I thought that Ray Liotta captured Roy DeMeo. You don't always have to necessarily look just like somebody to capture somebody's essence. I think that the pictures they show of Nico, Paul Sorvino look quite a bit like him, but I also think he caught him in essence. So send your hate mail if you disagree with me, but I'm going to stake my position there.
Oh, yeah, I remember that with the Roy DeMeo, Ray Liotta thing, or what have you.
We stirred up a little
with you too, right?
Minor hornet's nest on that one.
But you said like, oh, he plays it almost like he's cliche, but I mean, Niccolo is a cliche. Look at a picture of the guy. You know what I mean? Like you would look at him and you go, yeah, that guy's mafia. It's a mafia boss, right? He, like with the hat and the suit and like just the way he looks like a walking cliche of a mafia don. And I mean, because he was really.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say, so let's talk about a major part of the first two episodes, which we're going to really focus in on these first two episodes, is the 3 capo murders that Vito was involved with when he was a pretty young man that was in connection with the Bonanno family. Can you tell, we talked a little bit about it in the last episode, but let's flesh it out a little bit and maybe compare and contrast it with how they was presented in the TV show.
They kind of set it up. We talked about it on the previous episode. Like Carmine Galante was one of the first guys to really hone in on Montreal and kind of saw its potential in terms of drug trafficking. Well, he got killed, and it created a power vacuum in the Bonanno family. And basically, like Rastelli was named the head of the Bonanno family, but he was in prison at the time, and he was kind of in and out of prison a bunch of times, and it created like a power struggle within the Bonanno family. And you had like 2 factions. You had the rebels, which were the 3 capos, and that are Trinchera, Giacone, and Indelicato. I think I got those right.
That's right. That was probably as close as we're going to get.
They were the 3 rebel capos. I believe it was Indelicato. If they ended up winning, he was going to be the boss. And
he's Sonny Black, or no, he's Sonny Red.
I believe he was. Yeah, I believe he was the Sonny Red.
So Sonny Red, if anybody's out there has watched the Donnie Brasco movie, Sonny Red, that's Sonny Red.
Yeah.
Which we're going to have to tie this one all up again at another time, but keep going with the three capos murder.
Yeah, and then Joe Massino was the head of the loyalist faction, and to bring it back to Donnie Brasco, Sonny Black, who was played by Michael Madsen, was part of this loyalist faction. Joe Massino saw I'm going to stay loyal to Ristelli, and then when Ristelli passes on, because I believe he was pretty old at this time too, I'm going to be the head of the family, and maybe there was, other reasons for it too, where Joe Massino didn't like the idea of these three capos thinking they can just take over the family, because that's not how it's supposed to work. So they end up convincing the three capos to go to a restaurant, I believe it was called the 2020 Club, and Vito and two other gentlemen. I think one of them, they actually, till this day, they don't know who this other guy was, but we know for sure Vito was there. They're told to go hide in a closet, and George from Canada, George Shasha, I know it doesn't look like that if you end up looking up his name, but that's actually how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
He was called George from Canada. I guess he wasn't Canadian. He wasn't from Canada, but I guess he spent a lot of time in Canada, and him and Vito were pretty close. So they set it up in such a way that Vito and the other two gunmen were going to hide in the closet. These three capos are going to come in for a peace meeting, so they would be unarmed, which was like a mafia rule. Peace meetings, nobody's supposed to be packing. So, and George from Canada was going to rub his hand through his silver hair, and that was going to be the sign to come out and start shooting, which is what they did. And came out, started shooting. Joe Massino was there too. And he made sure that nobody was able to get out. And yeah, they killed the three of them.
And that was a huge deal in the mafia world, is the whacking of these three capos.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's really no other comparison I can think of. There's been bosses that have been killed, famously like Paul Castellano, and
so the whole Mustache Pete's, and kind of how that whole first generation mafia got completely wiped out in one fell swoop.
But in terms of taking out three capos at the same time, in one place, is probably one of the biggest hits, if not the biggest hit in mob history.
So how do you think that they treated that in the show Bad Blood?
Well, they set it up that Vito didn't know that this was going to go down, and it was supposed to be just kind of like a robbery, and Vito was well, why do you need us for this? So he's kind of questioning what is exactly going on here. But they kind of set up Vito almost kind of I don't know, he just kind of got thrown in this situation that never got asked to be in, and he's going to go to jail for these murders that he never actually killed anybody. I don't know, it's a little, I get why they do it, because they're trying to make him seem kind of sympathetic, and they're trying to set him up as kind of the anti-hero. I mean, in actuality, Vito never admitted to any of these murders, right? He just said he held a gun, right? And that was a big thing at the trial, because when the judge pressed him to admit to being involved in these murders, I don't think he ever actually, he said he was there and he had a gun, but he never actually shot anybody. So I don't know. I don't think Vito is telling the truth about that, considering what other people had said happened that night. But I get why they're trying to do it in the TV show, because they're trying to set Vito up for, he's kind of the bad guy hero.
Yeah, I think they were maybe trying to give a little sympathy, and maybe try and give him a little leeway, give Vito a little leeway before he gets thrown into the American jail. And I think they're maybe trying. You know what? I don't know. I don't know why they wouldn't just. Maybe he did it. Maybe he didn't do it. I think that probably he did do it. I don't know why they stake such a claim that he was just not only just an innocent person. Like I could see him that boss goes nuts and kills all three people, and maybe Vito's just there. But I don't know why they made such a stake in the ground that Vito was just set up almost in this.
The only explanation I can think of is, like I said, they try to make him seem like he's I don't know, kind of like the anti-hero.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you kind of need for a TV show like this, because there's really nothing, I don't know, there's really nothing sympathetic about Vito. Like he's trafficking heroin and cocaine, and like he's involved in prostitution and gambling and loan sharking and murder. There's really, you know what I mean? Like there's really nothing sympathetic about it. I mean, we can get it like there, I guess, when we get into later into the show and we end up talking about like what happened to, well, no, we did in the previous episode. We're not giving anything away. Like, I mean, we kind of do want to root for Vito when he does get out of prison, because his father was killed and his son was killed. But I don't understand this push to kind of make him seem kind of like the anti-hero.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I guess maybe in a way you can't have him completely unrepentant. You have to leave some humanity to him. I mean, let's be honest. They didn't bring Vito Rizzuto all the way from Montreal, Nico Rizzuto's son, into this power play in the Bonanno clan, and he didn't kill anybody. He didn't kill nobody in there. He killed some capos.
Oh yeah, it's he obviously did it, right? I mean, one little interesting, like the actual murders, I think maybe your audience might get a kick out of, is the three bodies were buried in the lot, which is, I guess, was a mafia graveyard that the Gambinos owned or ran. And John Gotti personally took care of the bodies for Joe Messino as a favor, because I guess they were buddies, obviously, right? So there's like a tie-in with Gotti there. I just thought maybe our audience would get a kick out of that.
I think that's the thing that keeps coming up, is there's so many connections. Gotti to Roy DeMeo, to all of these guys, to Lufthansa, to it's all of this like 1960s basically into the 2000s. All these guys are so interconnected.
It makes the story really confusing. Like I'm hoping we're doing a good job of like kind of explaining how this all went down, but it's well, you've been researching it yourself, right? There's so many like different spider webs, and it's a very difficult story to kind of keep on the straight and narrow and tell like a relatively linear narrative history too.
Yeah, I think that if anything of what we're doing here in this multi-part series on the Mafia is, if we can give you something, if it's interesting enough for what we're saying and that quenches your interest in it, then by all means. But if you want, I hope that in a way we're sparking more interest to go down the rabbit hole, because you will not, once you dive into this rabbit hole, it's very hard to get out of. It's so, it sucks you in when you start to, you almost feel like you get to know these people. And it's not a good thing. I don't feel like it's a good thing knowing this, but I think it's just so fascinating of this one corner of history of North American world history, really, that you fall into. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Is that you almost feel like you're kind of knowing these guys. It's kind of bizarre. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of people that they get into it and then they start like romanticizing these guys, and like at least I've made it pretty clear, like there's nothing really romantic about any of these guys. Like some of them are a little bit more likable than others. Like I'm not gonna lie, like John Gotti is somebody, just from doing general research on the mob, is somebody I kind of have a little bit of respect for, but at the end of the day, I mean, I know he was still trafficking like these drugs and prostitution and the murder and the loan sharking and, you know, the terror. I'm so, I mean, Gotti had like a likable personality, I guess, to a degree. There's certain qualities about him that are likable. Even Vito, right? In terms of the way that he was able to, you know, kind of keep the Hells Angels under control. And, you know, we'll get into it later in the show, but like there was a full on biker war when this was going on between the Hells Angels and another biker gang called the Rock Machine, which was the biggest biker war in North American history. By the end of it, it was like 150 bikers were dead. Vito was the only guy to really get these two groups to stop and declare peace with one another because it was causing too much heat and affecting everybody else's business. Not, you know, that's pretty incredible. Like we're talking about hardcore bikers, and Vito was able to get them to stop.
Just to even remove the fourth wall, I would just say that if you look at what we intended to do this Mafia series, I think we were initially going to do only maybe 3 episodes on the Mafia. And now we have basically no end in sight. I feel like that's how it drags you in. Once you get a little taste of this, you can't stop looking at it. And you know, we have series inside of the series already planned out. I think once you start going down this road of organized crime, and I think maybe that's how people get hooked on true crime, is I don't know if it's you get plugged into this kind of under the seedier part of humanity and you want to stop looking, but you just can't.
Oh yeah, for sure. I remember we were like first talking about like the Mafia series, and we're like all excited. It's like, oh man, like we got to do a bunch of these Mafia movies. And then like the list grew, and then we started, you know, doing some research for the episodes. Oh, we got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. And then, I mean, there's so much we haven't even scratched too. Like we haven't talked about Chicago. We haven't talked about, we haven't even talked about Gotti. We haven't talked about Whitey Bulger. There's so much material that we still got to go through.
So to wrap up, I think a good place to start wrapping up today is this series of murders with the 3 capos. It doesn't end. It eventually catches up to Vito. And even though Vito is living in Canada, he winds up having to do hard time in the US. How does Vito wind up? And that's the first 2 episodes really, is Vito going to prison in the US. How does he wind up going to prison in the United States? And how does this murders that happened many decades before catch up to Vito in the early 2000s?
Well, yeah. So good looking Sal, who was like a high member in the Bonanno family, he turned state. I believe it was good looking Sal. I should double check that, but I'll fix it. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it next episode. He turned state witness, right? And talked about what was going on in the Bonanno family. Basically, as soon as he turned, everyone else in the Bonanno family started turning, and they said Vito was at this murder and he murdered these 3 capos, right? Which was enough evidence to lay charges on him. But he was a Canadian citizen, and the Canadian government wouldn't do extradition if there was the possibility of the death penalty. So they got him on, I believe it was racketeering charges, and that's how they got him extradited. And then they charged him there for the 3 murders, because the Canadian government been trying forever to get Vito, and they just couldn't get anything on him. The Americans had something on them. They're like, okay, well, we have this law that we are not allowed to do this, so you guys got to find something else, and then you can have them. And what ended up happening. Vito gets charged for the murders, and he gets sent to the Supermax prison in Colorado, which is
Lawrence, Colorado.
Yeah, Florence, Colorado, which is one of the worst prisons in the world. It's terms of being isolated and what have you. Like this is where like Hannibal Lecter would get sent to. This is where terrorists get sent to. Other organized criminals would get sent to. The logic being the reason why it's so strict is you to really affect these guys, you have to completely isolate them from their criminal endeavors. Otherwise, even just like a phone call and they can still run everything. So this was the logic. And I mean, if you look at the history, I mean, there's arguments as cruel and unusual punishment, because I believe what is it, 20 hours of the day they have to stay in their own cell or something like that.
Generally, it's 23 hours. They'll get 1 hour out in the world.
Yeah. And I mean, and in Vito's case, it worked, right? Because he ended up being so isolated from what was going on in Montreal, having no real contact. I mean, this is something that the show changes a bit because like Declan goes and sees Vito, and I mean, I don't think that ever happened. It really did bring about the downfall of his criminal organization. And Sicily, they did the same thing too with it's slightly different. I don't think they have like supermax prisons in Italy, but they basically set up a system where like the mafia guys were just they were completely isolated from everything else. And it was effective. I mean, the Cosa Nostra hasn't been nearly as powerful in Sicily since then.
That was the one thing a bone I kind of had to pick with the show, and I can see why they did it. That Vito, it was basically like he was in regular jail. He had visits with Declan where they basically talked openly about Vito running the operation from jail, and Vito, they would be eating communal meals where they had fights between the white nationalists and him and other, like cliche jail things. And those supermax prisons, they are locked down in their cells. A little factoid about myself. I worked in a maximum security jail as a teacher for a little bit before I got a regular teaching job, like in a regular school. And even in the maximum security prison that I worked in, that wasn't supermax, I did get to tour through their what they called the hole, which was isolation. When they're in isolation, it is locked down. There's no sitting at communal tables. There's none of that stuff. And I have a feeling that they put in Vito, like you said, I don't even have a feeling. I know it. They put him in that Florence, Colorado Supermax so that it was basically like burying Vito in the deepest, darkest hole where he just could not run his operation. And like you said, when he came out, the operation was in shambles.
Yeah, I guess like the reason they changed up the prison scenes is if they truthfully did like a supermax prison, all right, like Vito was in the first 2 episodes and then
he's gone for 3.
He's gone. He's just like walking around in his cell and for 20 hours a day. You know what I mean? Right? Like you have to have, otherwise you just would be out of the story, right?
And then you miss all the prison cliches too of eating at these tables and getting messed with. And I think that's kind of a fun thing of crime shows is to watch the prison montages. So I guess you kind of miss out on that. I mean, they would honestly had to have completely rewritten the first 3 episodes if they had really faithfully shown life in a supermax.
Yeah. It just wouldn't have worked it wouldn't work.
I mean, they show a little bit when he gets locked up of how depressing it is of just being in your cell like that. I mean, in a lot of ways, I don't think that they would out and out say this, but in a way, these supermaxes are meant to crush their souls too and their spirits. I mean, in our criminal justice system, we don't want to really say that, the prison system is meant for rehabilitation and that sort of thing. But in other countries, like there's a famous Russian maximum security prison that's kind of like their version of Florence, Colorado. Like they don't play that. They're meant to absolutely crush these people. Like you're the worst of the worst, and you're going to the Black Dolphin prison in Siberia, and you're being totally separated from society. And you're not there to be rehabilitated. You're being there to be held away from polite society.
Well, and it's also set up in such a way as it forces them to talk, right? Like if you're staring at a sentence at, say, 25 years at a supermax prison, most people are going to talk, right? Paulie from Goodfellas said this too, right? Like that's the reason he was like had the harsh stance against drug trafficking, because the sentences were so harsh that it doesn't even matter. You could be like the most stand-up guy in the world, but if you're looking at 25 years in one of these types of prisons, you're probably going to talk. You rat out your own mother, he said, right? It works, right? I know that it works. It does work. People talk all the time because if you're in a prison cell for 20 hours a day and you're completely isolated and you're not allowed to talk to anybody, I'm sure within even the toughest guy, after a year, be like, okay, maybe I'll start talking.
And you look at it in comparison to the Canadian criminal justice system, which is the reason why I think they wanted to get Vito to the US is it's comparatively pretty luxurious compared to something like Florence Supermax. If he was going to get tossed into a Quebec jail, it wasn't going to be that bad for him, and he would have been able to fairly much run his operations completely in the clear and lived not too outrageously different than he would on the outside.
Well, even Andrew Scopa, who was kind of like the head of the Montreal mob after Rizzuto for a bit, there's a pretty good book about his like confessions where he like talks to a journalist. He mentions this because like up here in Canada, like the sentences aren't harsh enough. Like you guys aren't going to be able to really do anything about organized crime up here, because look at what they do in the States. They look at what they had to do to get rid of the mob in New York, like using RICO and harsh sentences. And people can quibble about, was it the right thing to do? But at the end of the day, it did. It crippled the American mob. I mean, obviously the mob is still around, organized crime is still around, but the highly centralized, organized crime of the five families that's not coming back. I mean, it might come back, but it's not coming back anytime soon because of the RICO laws and isolating people and getting them to talk and, being harsher. It worked.
Yeah, and the American Mafia just didn't have I would say the cultural carrots and sticks, kind of to borrow from Dan Carlin. It didn't have that where other, like the cartels and some of these other organized crime institutions have the carrots and the sticks still, where you don't talk, or your own family, your kids and your wife are on the chopping block. The American Mafia just doesn't have that built in anymore. And that's probably why they're struggling to keep up with these other groups like the cartels, where if you do open your trap in jail, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble. Your family's in big trouble. Your grandma's in big trouble. That's something that is a huge shift in organized crime.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And even like with the cartels case, I mean, they're so powerful. The state really can't even do too much about them to a degree. Like they can, but I mean, look at Pablo Escobar as an example, or he almost became president at one point. That's just how powerful he was. The American Mafia didn't have that, never had that type of I mean, they were powerful, but they never had that type of power.
I think we've set up these first two episodes, and the first two episodes of Bad Blood was really the table setting. We talked about the capo, the murder of the three capos. We talked about the family dynamics between Nico and his son Vito Rizzuto, and then their son Vito's son Nico Jr., who really wasn't a junior, but he was. You get the drift. And then the criminal organization that was set up in Montreal between all these various gangs. What can we look forward to in maybe the next two episodes?
Well, we're going to continue this story, right? Like, I guess me and you can discuss it later. Like, I wouldn't mind to kind of bring in a bit of the Hell's Angels story into this, right? Because the bikers end up playing like a bigger role, and even the hate. There's less known about the Haitian street gangs, but we can talk about that too. Yeah, because there's still a lot more history going on, and especially when we get to near the end of the show, there's a lot of basically current history that's going on. Like, it's not even really history. We're going to have to read like newspaper articles and stuff like that to really dig deep into it, because it's it's recent history. I mean, the mob war in Montreal is still kind of going on to this day.
That's a great place to end it. And Chris and I will have the conversation of where to go, but we also want to hear on where you want us to take this, because we can dive more into the bikers. We can keep going forward. We can go past this to, like Chris was saying, into what's really current events, things that were Andrew Scopa, which there's not even a show about him or a movie, which there probably really should be. He was just whacked almost in the times of COVID. Like, we're very much catching up into the modern era with this. So we would love to hear with you, Chris. It was awesome as always, and I can't wait to go into the next several episodes of Bad Blood.
Yeah, I had a blast doing this, especially talking about Renard Desjardins, because I really don't think you're going to hear anywhere else about him in terms of a video or a podcast. Maybe it's probably out there, but I didn't see anything. So maybe we're the first.
Yeah, I would have to say that in a lot of ways, I think we are cutting some new ground here in the podcast field, which is hard to cut new ground in. Yeah.
So I think generally the idea is we're going to kind of break the first season down 2 episodes at a time, right? Because it's like it's like the length of a movie, and I don't know, that might change, but I think that is the general idea going forward.
All right. That sounds good. And we will talk to you next time.